The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his tactical gear one final time. His team of 8 Navy SEALs had been inserted into this remote valley 3 days ago with a mission that seemed straightforward on paper: locate and eliminate a high-value target known only as the Ghost. Intelligence suggested this Taliban commander had been responsible for coordinating attacks that killed dozens of coalition forces over the past 6 months. Morrison's weathered face showed the strain of countless missions, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. At 34, he had led more special operations than most soldiers could imagine, yet something about this mission felt different. The intelligence was too clean, too perfect. In his experience, when things seemed too easy, they usually were. "Movement at 2 o'clock, whispered Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, his voice crackling through the tactical radio. Rodriguez had been with Morrison for 3 years, and his instincts had saved the team more than once. He was positioned 50 meters ahead, scanning the valley through his rifle scope. Morrison signaled for the team to halt. They had been moving through a narrow canyon for the past hour, following what their intelligence suggested was the Ghost's most likely escape route. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, creating natural choke points that made Morrison's tactical mind uneasy. It was the perfect place for an ambush, yet their mission parameters left them little choice but to continue forward. The team consisted of Morrison's most trusted operators. Besides Rodriguez, there was Chief Petty Officer Mike Chen, their demolitions expert whose steady hands had disarmed more improvised explosive devices than anyone cared to count. Petty Officer First Class Tommy Williams served as their medic, a former college football player whose gentle touch belied his massive frame. The youngest member, Petty Officer Second Class Alex Harper, was their sniper. Barely 25, but already showing the precision and patience that marked the best long-range shooters. Rounding out the team were Petty Officer First Class Carlos Mendez, their heavy weapons specialist who could make any firearm sing, and Petty Officer Second Class Jason Park, their intelligence analyst who had an uncanny ability to read terrain and enemy movements. Finally, there was Chief Warrant Officer Sam Blake, their second in command, a veteran of more missions than the rest of the team combined. As they moved deeper into the canyon, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence was too complete, too unnatural. Even the local wildlife seemed to have abandoned this stretch of the valley. His team moved with the fluid precision of years of training, each man knowing his role without need for verbal communication. Hand signals and subtle gestures conveyed more information than hours of briefings ever could. The intelligence briefing had painted a clear picture. The Ghost was reportedly holed up in a compound 3 kilometers ahead, protected by no more than a dozen fighters. Satellite imagery showed what appeared to be a straightforward assault scenario. Get in, eliminate the target, extract valuable intelligence, and get out. The kind of mission they had executed dozens of times before. But Morrison's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The path they were following was too obvious, too convenient. In 15 years of special operations, he had learned to trust those instincts above all else. They had kept him alive when logic and training had failed. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio again. "Sir, I've got eyes on the compound. Something's not right. No movement, no sentries. Place looks abandoned." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. An abandoned compound could mean they had arrived too late, or it could mean they were walking into a trap. Either scenario meant their mission was compromised. He signaled for the team to take defensive positions while he moved forward to join Rodriguez. Through his binoculars, Morrison could see what Rodriguez had observed. The compound sat at the end of the canyon like a waiting mouth. The building showed no signs of recent activity. No smoke from cooking fires, no movement of personnel, no vehicles. For a supposed terrorist stronghold, it looked remarkably lifeless. "Chen, what do you think?" Morrison asked his demolitions expert. Chen studied the compound through his scope for several long minutes before responding. "Could be wired, sir. Perfect setup for a remote detonation. Draw us in, then blow the whole place with us inside." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. They were in a narrow canyon with limited escape routes, approaching what might be a trap, and their extraction point was still 2 hours away on foot. Morrison weighed their options quickly. They could abort the mission and call for extraction, but that would mean losing their only lead on the Ghost. They could proceed with extreme caution, but that might alert any waiting enemies to their presence. As Morrison was considering their next move, Park suddenly grabbed his arm. "Sir, listen," he whispered urgently. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound Morrison had been dreading, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors. Not just one aircraft, but multiple helicopters approaching fast from different directions. The sound was growing louder by the second. "Contact left. Contact right." Rodriguez's voice exploded over the radio. Multiple enemy fighters moving in from both flanks. "We're surrounded." The canyon erupted in gunfire as muzzle flashes appeared from elevated positions on both sides of the valley. Morrison's team immediately returned fire, but they were caught in a devastating crossfire with nowhere to run. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly, turning the canyon into a killing field. "It's a setup," Chen shouted over the gunfire. The whole damn thing was a setup. Morrison realized with growing horror that they had walked directly into a carefully planned ambush. The intelligence about the ghost's location had been deliberately leaked to draw them into this canyon. Now they were trapped, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition with enemy helicopters closing in fast. The next few minutes would determine whether any of them would live to see another sunrise. As bullets ricocheted off the canyon walls around them, Morrison knew they needed a miracle. What he didn't know was that help was already watching from the distant hills, calculating range and wind speed through the scope of a Macmillan TAC-50 rifle. 3 kilometers away, perched on a rocky outcropping that provided perfect overwatch of the valley below, Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell adjusted the focus on her spotting scope and frowned. She had been tracking the SEAL team's movement for the past hour, and everything about their tactical situation screamed ambush to her experienced eye. Mitchell was not supposed to be there. Officially, she was on leave, visiting her sister in Germany after completing a grueling 6-month deployment as a sniper with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Unofficially, she had volunteered for an off-the-books reconnaissance mission, when intelligence reports suggested increased Taliban activity in this particular region of Afghanistan. At 29, Mitchell had more confirmed kills than any other female sniper in military history. Her weapon of choice, the Macmillan TAC-50, had become an extension of herself over countless missions. The massive .50 caliber rifle was capable of precise shots at distances exceeding 2 kilometers, and in Mitchell's hands, it had never failed to find its mark. She had been monitoring enemy communications for the past week using specialized equipment that officially didn't exist. What she had discovered chilled her to the bone. The Taliban had been planning this ambush for months, using a sophisticated disinformation campaign to lure American special forces into this exact location. The ghost wasn't just a target. He was the bait in a trap designed to eliminate an entire SEAL team and capture valuable intelligence about American special operations capabilities. "Sarah to base. I have eyes on 8 American operators moving into what appears to be a prepared ambush site." She spoke quietly into her encrypted radio. "Multiple enemy positions, estimate 40 to 50 hostiles with heavy weapons and air support inbound." The response crackled back immediately. "Sarah, this is Colonel Harrison. You are not authorized to engage. Repeat, do not engage. We have no assets in that area." Mitchell's jaw tightened. She knew what that meant. The SEAL team below was operating under such deep cover that even their own command structure was denying their existence. If they died in that canyon, there would be no official record of their sacrifice, no families notified, no flags folded at military funerals. Through her scope, she watched the SEALs take defensive positions as enemy fighters began moving into flanking positions. The Americans were skilled and disciplined, but they were walking into a killing field with no knowledge of what awaited them. Mitchell began calculating ranges and wind patterns, her mind automatically running through the complex mathematics of long-range precision shooting. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and Mitchell could see 3 aircraft moving in from different directions. Through her scope, she identified them as modified Mi-8 helicopters, each carrying a full squad of fighters. Once those helicopters reached the canyon, the Americans below would have no chance of survival. "Base, the Americans are about to be overrun. I can provide support from my position." "Negative, Sarah. You are officially not there and neither are they. Maintain observation only." Mitchell set down her radio and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, regardless of the outcome. She had sworn an oath to protect American lives, and she wasn't going to watch 8 brave men die because of bureaucratic politics and plausible deniability. The first helicopter was approaching the canyon when the ambush began. Muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the valley, as dozens of enemy fighters opened fire simultaneously. The SEALs responded with disciplined return fire, but Mitchell could see they were hopelessly outnumbered and trapped in an impossible tactical situation. She began identifying priority targets through her scope. The enemy had positioned machine gun nests at key choke points, making any escape attempt suicidal. Rocket-propelled grenade teams were moving into position to eliminate the Americans with indirect fire. Most critically, she could see a group of enemy fighters setting up a heavy mortar that would rain death down on the trapped SEALs within minutes. Mitchell chambered a round in her TAC-50 and settled into her shooting position. At 2,847 meters, this would be one of the longest shots of her career, complicated by shifting wind patterns and the fact that she would be firing downhill into a canyon that created its own microclimate. She would have to account for the Coriolis effect, barometric pressure, temperature variations, and a dozen other factors that could send her bullet wide of the mark. Her first target would be the mortar team leader, a bearded fighter who was directing the setup of the heavy weapon. Eliminating him would buy the Americans precious time, but it would also reveal her position to every enemy fighter in the valley. Once she fired, she would become the primary target of every weapon within range. Through her radio, she could hear the increasing desperation in the American voices as their situation deteriorated. They were running low on ammunition and had already taken casualties. The lead helicopter was less than 30 seconds from inserting additional enemy fighters directly behind their position. Mitchell controlled her breathing and felt her heart rate slow as she entered the zone that separated elite snipers from ordinary marksmen. The world narrowed to the crosshairs of her scope, the gentle pressure of her finger on the trigger, and the mathematical precision required to send death across nearly 3 kilometers of hostile territory. She made minute adjustments to compensate for a subtle wind shift, elevated her point of aim to account for bullet drop, and began the slow, steady trigger squeeze that would announce her presence to every enemy in the valley. The mortar team leader was barking orders to his men, completely unaware that death was streaking toward him at over 2,500 feet per second. The shot felt perfect the moment it left the barrel. The TAC-50 roared with authority, the massive muzzle flash temporarily blinding her night vision. For a fraction of a second, silence returned to the valley. Then chaos erupted as her bullet found its mark with devastating precision. The enemy mortar position exploded in confusion as their leader dropped like a stone. Mitchell was already chambering her next round, searching for her second target through the scope. The helicopter was directly over the canyon now, rappelling ropes dropping toward the trapped Americans below. But Mitchell had announced her presence, and now dozens of enemy fighters were turning their weapons toward the hills, where her muzzle flash had revealed her position. Morrison heard the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle echoing across the canyon, just as enemy fighters began fast roping from the helicopter hovering above their position. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, he saw the enemy mortar team's leader collapse, his body going limp in the characteristic way that meant an instant kill from a precision shot. "Where the hell did that come from?" Chen shouted over the noise, pressing himself against the canyon wall as bullets sparked off the rocks around him. Morrison's tactical mind was already processing the implications. Someone with a long-range rifle was providing overwatch from the hills, and that someone had just eliminated their most immediate threat. The mortar would have killed them all within the next minute. But now the mysterious sniper had revealed their position and drawn enemy fire away from his team. "Unknown friendly sniper, this is SEAL Team 7 actual," Morrison spoke into his radio, hoping whoever had taken that shot was monitoring their frequency. "Acknowledge if you copy." The response came immediately in a calm female voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. "SEAL 7 actual, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on your position and multiple enemy targets. Keep your heads down, a woman." Morrison filed that information away as he watched enemy fighters pour down ropes from the helicopter. His team was still trapped and heavily outnumbered, but now they had an angel of death watching over them from the distant hills. Mitchell had already acquired her second target through the TAC-50's scope. The helicopter pilot was maintaining a steady hover, making his aircraft a sitting duck for anyone with the range to reach him. At almost 3 kilometers, it would be an extremely difficult shot, but Mitchell had made harder ones. The key was timing her shot between the helicopter's subtle movements and the wind gusts sweeping through the canyon. She controlled her breathing and settled the crosshairs on the cockpit. The pilot was focused on maintaining position while his passengers rappelled down to the canyon floor. He never saw death approaching at supersonic speed. The .50 caliber round punched through the helicopter's windscreen and found its target with surgical precision. The aircraft immediately began spinning out of control, its tail rotor slicing through the rappelling ropes and sending several enemy fighters plummeting to the canyon floor. The helicopter crashed into the opposite canyon wall in a spectacular fireball that temporarily illuminated the entire valley. "Holy shit," Williams breathed from his position behind a boulder. "Whoever that is, they just saved our asses." But Mitchell's celebration was short-lived. The enemy had triangulated her position from her muzzle flashes, and now she was taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Bullets were impacting all around her rocky outcropping, forcing her to relocate before she could engage additional targets. She grabbed her rifle and combat pack, sprinting across the rocky terrain as machine gun fire chewed up the ground behind her. Mitchell had spent years training in mountain warfare, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in harsh terrain. But she was now fighting a running battle against dozens of enemy fighters who were converging on her position. "Overwatch, this is SEAL 7 Actual." Morrison's voice crackled through her radio. "You are taking heavy fire. We are attempting to break out of our position to assist." "Negative, SEAL 7, Mitchell replied, breathing heavily as she took cover behind a cluster of rocks 200 meters from her original position. "Stay in position. I can handle this." Through her scope, she could see that the second helicopter was approaching the canyon, and a third aircraft was visible in the distance. The enemy was committing everything they had to this ambush, determined to eliminate the American Special Forces team and capture valuable intelligence. What they hadn't counted on was a lone sniper, with the skill and determination to single-handedly change the balance of the battle. Mitchell began systematically eliminating high-value targets throughout the valley. Machine gun nests that had pinned down the SEALs suddenly went silent as their operators fell to precision shots. RPG teams found themselves without leaders as Mitchell's bullets found their marks with mechanical precision. Each shot was a calculated decision, designed to maximize the SEAL's chances of survival while conserving her limited ammunition. But the enemy was learning to adapt. They began using smoke grenades to obscure their movements and started coordinating their attacks to present multiple targets simultaneously. Mitchell found herself facing an increasingly difficult tactical puzzle as enemy fighters closed in on her position from 3 directions. Rodriguez had managed to establish communication with their extraction team, but the news was not encouraging. "Sir, extraction is still 40 minutes out. They can't risk the helicopters until we neutralize the air defenses." Morrison surveyed their tactical situation with growing concern. They had eliminated perhaps a dozen enemy fighters, but more kept appearing from concealed positions throughout the canyon. Their ammunition was running dangerously low, and they had 2 wounded men who needed immediate medical attention. Park had taken shrapnel from a grenade blast, and Mendez was bleeding heavily from a bullet wound to his shoulder. "Overwatch, what's your ammunition status?" Morrison asked. Mitchell's response was calm despite the bullets whining past her head. "SEAL 7, I have 12 rounds remaining. I need to make them count, 12 rounds, against 40 remaining enemy fighters, with 2 more helicopters inbound and her own position rapidly being overrun." The mathematics of their survival were becoming increasingly grim. That's when Chen made an observation that would change everything. "Sir, look at the pattern of their movement. They're herding us toward the compound. This isn't just an ambush, they want to capture us alive." Morrison realized Chen was right. The enemy fire was intense but not concentrated in the areas where it would be most lethal. They were being driven in a specific direction, toward buildings where they could be trapped and overwhelmed without being killed. Someone wanted American Special Forces operators taken alive, probably for intelligence purposes and propaganda value. "Overwatch, are you monitoring this conversation?" Morrison asked. "Affirmative, SEAL 7, I see the pattern. They want prisoners." Mitchell understood the implications immediately. If the SEALs were captured alive, they would face torture, interrogation, and eventual execution on camera for the world to see. That could never be allowed to happen. She looked through her scope at the remaining enemy fighters and began planning the most important 12 shots of her career. The second helicopter was approaching fast, and she could see fighters preparing to fast rope down into the canyon. Once those reinforcements arrived, even her precision shooting wouldn't be enough to turn the tide of battle. She had perhaps 2 minutes before the tactical situation became completely hopeless. Mitchell chambered around and began the mental calculations that would determine whether 8 American heroes lived or died in a forgotten canyon halfway around the world. Mitchell's mind raced through the tactical calculations as the second helicopter approached the canyon. She had 12 rounds left, approximately 30 enemy fighters still active, and 2 aircraft full of reinforcements about to arrive. The mathematics were brutal, but she had faced impossible odds before. Her first priority had to be the helicopters. Aircraft represented force multiplication that could overwhelm even the best ground fighters. She tracked the approaching Mi-8 through her scope, noting its flight pattern and the way it was setting up for another insertion of fighters directly behind the SEAL team's position. The pilot was good, varying his altitude and speed to make targeting difficult. But Mitchell had studied helicopter tactics extensively during her advanced sniper training. She knew that pilots had to stabilize their aircraft during insertion operations, creating brief windows of opportunity for a skilled marksman. She waited, controlling her breathing as enemy bullets continued to impact around her position. Her concealment behind the rocky outcropping was solid, but it wouldn't last much longer. She could hear enemy fighters moving through the rocks above her, trying to get an angle on her position. Time was running out for everyone in the canyon. The helicopter pilot began his approach to hover, and Mitchell saw her opportunity. She led the target slightly, accounting for the aircraft's forward momentum, and squeezed the trigger. The TAC-50 roared, and her bullet found the helicopter's main rotor assembly. The aircraft immediately began spinning violently as metal fragments tore through its flight controls. This pilot was more skilled than the first, managing to maintain some control as his aircraft went down. Instead of crashing directly into the canyon wall, he managed to bring the helicopter down in a controlled crash that scattered debris across the valley floor but didn't result in the spectacular explosion that had marked the first aircraft's demise, but the crash landing threw the enemy's insertion timeline into chaos. Fighters who should have been reinforcing the canyon floor were instead trapped in a burning aircraft or scattered across the rocky terrain. Mitchell had bought precious time, but at the cost of revealing her exact position to the enemy fighters who were now closing in from multiple directions. SEAL 7. "This is Overwatch," she spoke into her radio while chambering another round. "I'm about to be overrun. I need you to listen carefully." Morrison pressed himself against the canyon wall as bullets sparked off the rocks inches from his head. "Go ahead, Overwatch. There are 3 machine gun nests still operational. 2 on your left flank at your 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock positions. 1 on the right at your 10 o'clock. I can eliminate 2 of them, but you'll need to suppress the 3rd while I relocate." Mitchell was already moving as she spoke, using the terrain to mask her movement while enemy fighters tried to track her position. Her years of mountain warfare training served her well as she bounded between cover points, always staying 1 step ahead of the converging enemy forces. She found a new firing position 60 meters from her previous location and immediately began engaging the first machine gun nest. Through her scope, she could see 3 fighters manning a heavy weapon that had been pouring devastating fire down on the trapped SEALs. Her shot took out the gunner instantly, and the weapon fell silent. The second machine gun nest was more challenging, positioned in a rocky alcove that provided excellent protection from her angle of attack. Mitchell had to wait for one of the enemy fighters to expose himself while reloading his weapon. When he leaned out from cover to clear a jam in his gun, her bullet found him with mechanical precision. 2 down. SEAL 7. "The 3rd nest is yours." Morrison signaled to Chen and Blake, who moved with fluid coordination to flank the remaining machine gun position. Years of training and combat experience allowed them to communicate without words, each man instinctively knowing his role in the assault. Chen's explosion expertise came into play as he used a fragmentation grenade to clear the position, while Blake provided covering fire that kept the enemy fighters pinned down. But even with 3 machine gun nests eliminated, the tactical situation remained desperate. Mitchell counted at least 20 enemy fighters still active in the canyon, and she could see movement that suggested more fighters were moving in from positions outside her field of view. The 3rd helicopter was circling the valley, its crew clearly trying to determine the safest approach, given the fate of the previous two aircraft. Overwatch. I need you to focus on that helicopter, Morrison called over the radio. We can handle the ground forces if you can keep them from getting air support. Mitchell studied the circling aircraft through her scope. This pilot was being much more cautious, staying at maximum range while his crew assessed the threat. He was flying an irregular pattern that made targeting extremely difficult, never maintaining the same altitude or heading for more than a few seconds. She would get one shot, maybe two if she was lucky. Miss and the helicopter would withdraw to call in additional support that would overwhelm both her and the SEAL team. The pressure was enormous, but Mitchell had faced similar situations before. She forced herself to enter the mental zone where external distractions disappeared and only the target mattered. The pilot made his mistake when he stabilized his aircraft to allow his crew to get a better view of the canyon floor. For perhaps 3 seconds, the helicopter maintained steady flight while the crew tried to locate the sniper who had destroyed 2 of their aircraft. 3 seconds was an eternity for a marksman of Mitchell's caliber. Her shot was perfect, punching through the helicopter's fuel tank and igniting the aviation fuel in a massive fireball that lit up the entire valley. The aircraft disintegrated in midair, raining debris across the mountainside and eliminating the enemy's air support capability. But Mitchell's position was now completely compromised. Enemy fighters were converging on her location from 3 directions, and she had only 8 rounds remaining. She could hear voices getting closer, the distinctive sound of men moving carefully through rocky terrain while trying to maintain stealth. SEAL 7, I am taking heavy contact and may not be able to provide additional support, she reported, while moving to yet another position. Morrison could hear the strain in her voice and realized that their guardian, Angel, was fighting for her own survival. His team was still trapped in the canyon with diminishing ammunition and 2 wounded men. The enemy had lost their air support, but they still had overwhelming numbers and were using the terrain to their advantage. That's when Park, despite his wounds, made an observation that would change the entire tactical dynamic. Sir, I've been monitoring enemy communications. They're getting orders to take us alive at all costs. Someone very important wants to interrogate American Special Forces operators. Morrison realized this information represented both a threat and an opportunity. The enemy's desire to capture them alive meant they would be reluctant to use their most devastating weapons. But it also meant that escape would be nearly impossible. A wounded animal was often more dangerous than a healthy one. Overwatch, did you copy that last transmission? Mitchell's response came between bursts of enemy gunfire that was getting uncomfortably close to her position. Affirmative, SEAL 7, I understand the implications. We need to change the rules of this engagement. Mitchell crouched behind a granite boulder as bullets whined overhead, her mind racing through the tactical possibilities. The enemy's desire to capture the SEALs alive was both a blessing and a curse. It meant they were holding back their most lethal attacks, but it also meant they would never give up the pursuit. She had 8 rounds left, and at least 15 enemy fighters were closing in on her position from 3 different directions. Her radio crackled with Morrison's voice. Overwatch, we need to coordinate a breakout attempt. Can you provide covering fire for a movement to the north wall of the canyon? Mitchell studied the terrain through her scope, calculating angles and distances. The north wall offered the best opportunity for the SEALs to establish a defensive position, but reaching it would require crossing 200 meters of open ground under enemy fire. Even with her precision shooting, it would be a desperate gamble. SEAL 7, I can give you covering fire, but I'll need to expose myself to get clear shots at the fighters blocking that route. Once I do, my position becomes untenable. Morrison understood what she was saying. The sniper who had saved their lives multiple times over the past hour was preparing to sacrifice herself to give them a chance at escape. It was the kind of heroic decision that defined the best of America's warriors, but it also meant they were about to lose their most valuable asset. Overwatch, there has to be another way. We don't leave people behind. Mitchell smiled grimly despite her desperate situation. She had heard about the SEALs' legendary loyalty to their teammates, but experiencing it firsthand was something different entirely. These men were willing to risk their own lives for someone they had never met, whose name they didn't even know. SEAL 7. Listen carefully. I have a plan, but it requires perfect timing and coordination. There's a cluster of rocks about 50 meters north of your position. If you can reach that location, you'll have a clear field of fire down the canyon while being protected from the flanking positions. Morrison studied the area she described. It was a good tactical position, but reaching it would require his team to move through a gauntlet of enemy fire. They would need every advantage they could get. What do you need from us, Overwatch? I need you to create a distraction. Something big enough to draw their attention away from that movement route. Can your demolitions expert create some fireworks? Chen overheard the conversation and immediately began inventorying his remaining explosives. Sir, I've got enough C4 to bring down that rock formation on the east side of the canyon. It would create a massive slide that might block some of their positions. Mitchell could see the rock formation Chen was referring to through her scope. It was a precarious-looking overhang that had probably been weathered by centuries of mountain storms. A properly placed charge could indeed bring it down, creating both a distraction and a physical barrier that would complicate the enemy's movement. Do it, Morrison ordered. Overwatch, how long do you need? Give me 90 seconds to get into position. When that rock comes down, I'll start picking off anyone who tries to block your movement route. Mitchell began her most dangerous movement yet, sprinting across open ground while enemy fighters tried to track her with their weapons. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet as she bounded from cover to cover, using every technique she had learned in years of combat operations. She could hear voices shouting in Pashto as the enemy fighters tried to coordinate their pursuit. She reached a rocky outcropping that provided a perfect shooting position overlooking the canyon. From here, she could see the route the SEALs would need to take, and she could identify the enemy fighters who were in position to block their movement. But she was also completely exposed to return fire from multiple directions. Chen's explosive charge detonated with tremendous force, sending tons of rock cascading down the canyon wall. The sound was deafening, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Dust and debris filled the air, temporarily reducing visibility throughout the valley. Mitchell used the confusion to begin engaging targets with mechanical precision. Her first shot eliminated a fighter who had been moving to block the SEAL's escape route. Her second shot took out an RPG team that was preparing to fire on the American position. Each shot was carefully calculated to maximum effect with her dwindling ammunition supply. Move now, SEAL 7, she called over the radio while chambering another round. Morrison led his team in a coordinated rush toward the rock cluster, each man covering his teammates while advancing under fire. Williams had Mendez over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, while Park managed to keep up despite his shrapnel wounds. The team moved with the fluid precision that came from years of training and combat experience. Mitchell continued to provide covering fire, her rifle speaking with deadly authority each time an enemy fighter tried to interfere with the SEAL's movement. But she was taking increasingly heavy return fire, and she could see enemy fighters moving to flank her position from both sides. Her fifth shot of the engagement took out a machine gunner who was trying to set up a position that would have trapped the SEALs in the open. Her sixth shot eliminated a spotter who was calling in coordinates for mortar fire. Each bullet represented a life saved and a step closer to the SEAL's survival. SEAL 7, I have visual on your team reaching the objective. You should have good defensive positions from that location. Morrison's team had indeed reached the rocky cluster, and the position was even better than they had hoped. They had clear fields of fire in multiple directions and solid cover from the granite boulders. For the first time in the past hour, they had a defensive position that they could actually hold. But Mitchell's situation was becoming impossible. She had 2 rounds left and enemy fighters were closing in from 3 directions. She could see muzzle flashes getting closer as the fighters bounded from cover to cover, steadily tightening the noose around her position. Overwatch, what's your status? Morrison called. Mitchell's response was calm despite the desperate nature of her situation. SEAL 7, I have 2 rounds remaining and approximately 10 enemy fighters within 50 meters of my position. I don't think I'm going to make it out of this one. The canyon fell momentarily silent except for the distant sound of voices as enemy fighters continued their approach. Morrison realized that the woman who had saved their lives was preparing to make her last stand on a lonely mountaintop in Afghanistan. Overwatch, we're coming to get you. Negative, SEAL 7, you have wounded men and limited ammunition. Stay in position and prepare for extraction. That's an order. Morrison almost smiled at the absurdity of receiving orders from someone whose name he didn't even know, but he also recognized the voice of someone who had accepted their fate and was prepared to face it with courage and dignity. Mitchell chambered her next to last round and acquired a target through her scope. The enemy fighter was moving carefully through the rocks, unaware that he was being watched by someone who had never missed at this range. Her shot was perfect, dropping him instantly and buying her a few more seconds of life. 1 round left, 10 enemy fighters closing in from multiple directions. Mitchell chambered her final bullet and began searching for the target that would make her death count for the most. Mitchell pressed her eye against the scope, searching for the most valuable target among the enemy fighters converging on her position. Through her crosshairs, she spotted a figure directing the assault, an older man with elaborate tactical gear who was clearly the local commander. Taking him out would throw the enemy into confusion, possibly buying the SEALs precious additional time. She controlled her breathing, made minute adjustments for windage, and began her final trigger squeeze. The TAC-50 roared one last time and the enemy commander dropped instantly. Shouts of confusion echoed across the mountainside as the remaining fighters lost their coordination. But Mitchell's ammunition was now exhausted, and enemy fighters were less than 30 meters away. She drew her sidearm, knowing that her 9mm pistol would be little match for the AK-47s closing in on her position. Still, she had no intention of surrendering. American Special Forces operators didn't get captured alive if they could help. That's when the sound she had been hoping to hear finally reached her ears, the distinctive whine of turbine engines approaching fast from the east. The extraction helicopters were finally inbound, still 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Someone had obviously realized the gravity of the situation and authorized emergency support. SEAL 7, this is Rescue 1-2, inbound your position with full combat package. Pop smoke and prepare for immediate extraction. Morrison felt a surge of relief at hearing the helicopter pilot's voice, but his concern immediately shifted to the sniper who had saved their lives. Rescue 1-2, we have a friendly sniper approximately 500 meters south of our position. She is taking heavy contact and needs immediate assistance. Copy that. SEAL 7, Rescue 1-3 is breaking off to provide close air support for your sniper. Mitchell heard the radio traffic and felt a mixture of hope and disbelief. After years of operating in the shadows with minimal support, friendly aircraft were actually coming to her rescue. But the enemy fighters were getting closer, and she could hear them calling out positions as they coordinated their final assault on her location. She used her remaining grenades to slow their advance, the explosions buying her precious seconds while she prepared to make her last stand with only her pistol and combat knife. The rocky outcropping that had provided such excellent shooting positions now felt like a trap, as enemy fighters approached from multiple angles. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, and suddenly the mountainside erupted in devastating fire as the rescue helicopter opened up with its door-mounted machine guns. Tracer rounds streaked across the terrain, forcing the enemy fighters to dive for cover. The pilot was flying dangerously low, using the helicopter's superior firepower to break up the assault on Mitchell's position. Overwatch, this is Rescue 1-3. We have you in sight. Stay down while we clear your area. Mitchell pressed herself against the rocks as the helicopter made repeated strafing runs, systematically eliminating the enemy fighters who had been closing in on her position. The pilot's skill was remarkable, placing accurate fire within meters of her location without endangering her safety. Meanwhile, the main extraction helicopter had reached the SEAL team's position. Morrison quickly organized the evacuation of his wounded men, while maintaining defensive fire against the remaining enemy forces. The helicopter crew chief was already on the ground, helping to carry Mendez and Park aboard the aircraft. SEAL 7, we need to go now, the pilot called over the rotor noise. More enemy forces are converging on this location. Morrison looked toward the hills where their mysterious guardian angel was fighting for her life. We're not leaving without Overwatch. The rescue helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the radio. SEAL 7, Rescue 1-3 has your sniper. She's wounded but alive. We'll meet you at the extraction point. Mitchell had indeed been hit by shrapnel from one of the enemy grenades, but her wounds were not life-threatening. The helicopter crew chief was already treating her injuries as the aircraft climbed away from the mountainside. She looked down at the canyon where 8 American heroes had nearly died in an elaborate trap, grateful that her intervention had made the difference between life and death. What's your name, soldier? The crew chief asked while bandaging her arm. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, 75th Rangers, she replied, her voice hoarse from the stress and exertion of the past hour. As both helicopters flew toward safety, Morrison finally had a chance to process what had just occurred. A single sniper, operating alone and without official support, had single-handedly turned the tide of a battle that should have resulted in the death or capture of his entire team. Her precision shooting and tactical expertise had been the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The extraction point was a forward operating base 50 kilometers from the ambush site. As the helicopters touched down, Morrison was already planning how to properly recognize the woman who had saved 8 American lives through skill, courage, and selfless dedication to duty. Mitchell was taken to the base medical facility for treatment of her wounds, while Morrison's team underwent debriefing with intelligence officers who wanted to understand how their operation had been compromised. The official reports would describe a successful mission despite enemy contact, but they would not mention the unauthorized sniper who had made success possible. 3 days later, Morrison found Mitchell in the hospital ward where she was recovering from surgery to remove shrapnel from her shoulder. She was awake and alert, reading a paperback novel while her arm remained in a sling. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," Morrison said formally as he approached her bed. "Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, SEAL Team 7. I believe we owe you our lives." Mitchell looked up from her book and smiled. "Just doing my job, sir. Though technically I wasn't supposed to be doing it in that particular location." Morrison pulled up a chair beside her bed. "According to my intelligence briefing, there were no American assets in that area of operations. Officially, you were never there, and neither were we." "That's probably for the best," Mitchell replied. "Some missions are better left off the official records." Morrison reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal object, a challenge coin bearing the SEAL Team 7 insignia. "This is from all 8 members of my team. We want you to have it." Mitchell accepted the coin with genuine emotion. In the special operations community, challenge coins were more than mere tokens. They represented brotherhood, respect, and recognition of exceptional service. Coming from a SEAL team, this particular coin represented the highest form of professional recognition she could receive. "Thank you, Commander. That means more than you know." Morrison stood to leave, then turned back with one final thought. "Sergeant Mitchell, if you ever decide you want to work with SEALs on a permanent basis, I know some people who would be very interested in talking to you." Mitchell smiled and held up the challenge coin, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sunlight streaming through the hospital window. "I'll definitely consider that, sir." As Morrison left the hospital, he reflected on the events that had brought them together in that remote Afghan valley. Military operations often came down to split-second decisions made by individuals who chose to do the right thing, regardless of personal risk. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell had made such a decision, and 8 American warriors were alive because of her courage and skill. The official after-action report would describe a successful special operations mission despite enemy contact. It would not mention that the success had depended entirely on a lone sniper who had violated orders, exceeded her authority, and risked everything to save the lives of men she had never met. But in the informal networks that connected America's special operations community, the story would be told and retold. The tale of the day when a woman's TAC-50 had thundered from the hills and turned defeat into victory, when precision shooting and moral courage had combined to snatch 8 lives from the jaws of death. Some stories never made it into the history books, but they lived on in the memories of those who understood that freedom's price was often paid by individuals whose names would never be known to the people they protected. Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell was one of those individuals, and her actions on that day had earned her a place in the brotherhood of warriors who knew that sometimes one person really could make all the difference.